Sarah Mitchell never imagined that a routine morning jog along the coastal path near Naval Base Coronado would change her life forever. The 32-year-old marine biologist had moved to San Diego 6 months earlier to work with the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, studying the migration patterns of Pacific dolphins. Her daily runs had become a sacred ritual, a way to clear her mind before diving into complex research data. On this particular Tuesday morning in September, the California sun painted the horizon in shades of amber and gold. Sarah had chosen her usual route along the beach, unaware that she was about to stumble into one of the most intense military training exercises the Navy SEALs had conducted in recent memory. The morning air was crisp, filled with the scent of salt water and seaweed, as she maintained her steady pace along the shoreline. What Sarah didn't know was that 301 of the Navy's most elite warriors were conducting a classified counterterrorism simulation just beyond the dunes. The exercise, codenamed Operation Tidal Force, was designed to test the SEALs' ability to respond to a hypothetical terrorist infiltration scenario. The training area had been carefully marked and secured, but in the pre-dawn darkness, one crucial perimeter sign had been knocked down by strong coastal winds. As Sarah rounded a familiar bend in the coastal path, she noticed unusual activity ahead. Dark figures moved with military precision across the beach, and the distant sound of coordinated movements reached her ears. Her scientific mind immediately became curious about this unexpected human behavior in what she considered her peaceful research territory. She slowed her pace, trying to understand what she was witnessing. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison was leading Alpha Team through a complex beach assault simulation when his peripheral vision caught sight of an unexpected civilian presence. The 34-year-old SEAL veteran had completed 4 tours overseas and possessed the kind of situational awareness that had kept him alive in the most dangerous corners of the world. Something about the lone figure approaching their training zone triggered every instinct he had developed over 12 years of military service. Sarah's athletic frame and confident stride initially suggested to Morrison that she might be part of the exercise. Her dark running attire and purposeful movement pattern could easily be mistaken for tactical gear in the limited morning light. However, as she drew closer, Morrison realized that this woman was not supposed to be there. The training scenario had called for all participants to be accounted for, and this individual was definitely not on their roster. The simulation had reached a critical phase where the SEAL teams were practicing responses to a mock terrorist who had supposedly infiltrated their ranks. The exercise required split-second decision-making and absolute trust in identifying friend from foe. Morrison's training kicked in as he observed Sarah's approach, and he made the tactical decision that would soon escalate into something none of them had prepared for. Sarah noticed the sudden shift in the military personnel's behavior as she continued jogging. What had been coordinated training movements suddenly became focused attention directed toward her. She felt multiple pairs of eyes tracking her movement, and an uncomfortable sensation began building in her chest. Her background in marine biology had taught her to recognize predatory behavior patterns in ocean creatures, and something about the current human dynamics triggered similar warning signals. Morrison raised his hand in a tactical signal that immediately communicated to his 300 fellow SEALs that a potential threat had been identified. The response was instantaneous and overwhelming. 3 centuries of military training, representing thousands of hours of combat preparation and tactical expertise, suddenly focused on one unsuspecting marine biologist who had simply chosen the wrong morning for her regular exercise routine. Sarah's confusion deepened as she realized that the military personnel were not just observing her, but actively positioning themselves in response to her presence. The scientific part of her mind tried to rationalize what was happening. Perhaps she had inadvertently wandered into a restricted area. Maybe there was some kind of security protocol she was unaware of. However, her instincts were beginning to suggest that something far more serious was developing. The morning light revealed the true scope of what Sarah had stumbled into. Across the beach and hidden among the dunes, she could now make out the shapes of hundreds of highly trained warriors, all of whom seemed to be treating her as some kind of significant concern. The weight of their collective attention was unlike anything she had ever experienced. It felt as though she had suddenly become the focal point of an incredibly powerful and potentially dangerous force. Morrison's hand moved toward his communication device as he prepared to report the unexpected civilian presence. However, the training scenario's parameters required him to treat any unidentified individual as a potential threat until proven otherwise. The simulation had been designed to test their responses to exactly this kind of situation, and Morrison found himself caught between following training protocols and recognizing that something about this situation felt fundamentally different from their prepared scenarios. Sarah's doctoral training in marine biology had required her to study animal behavior under stress, particularly how creatures respond when they suddenly find themselves surrounded by potential predators. As she processed the current situation, she realized that she was experiencing exactly the kind of scenario she had observed countless times in her research, except this time she was the creature who had wandered into dangerous territory. The coastal wind carried the sound of coordinated movement as the SEAL teams adjusted their positions in response to Morrison's signals. Sarah could hear the subtle sounds of equipment being prepared and personnel moving with practiced stealth. Her scientific background had trained her to pay attention to environmental details, and every sense was now telling her that she had become the center of something much larger and more complex than a simple training exercise. Morrison studied Sarah's body language and movement patterns, looking for any signs that might indicate hostile intent or advanced training. Her jogging pace had slowed, but she maintained forward momentum toward their position. Her posture suggested confusion rather than tactical awareness, but Morrison's experience had taught him that appearances could be deliberately deceptive. The morning's exercise had specifically included scenarios involving individuals who might not appear to be immediate threats. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to understand the appropriate response to her current situation. Her instinct was to simply turn around and leave the area, but something about the intensity of the attention focused on her suggested that sudden movements might not be advisable. She had read enough about military protocols to understand that unexpected behavior during training exercises could potentially be interpreted as threatening, even when no threat was intended. The September morning sun climbed higher above the horizon, casting longer shadows across the beach and providing better visibility for everyone involved. What had begun as a routine training exercise was rapidly evolving into something that none of the participants had anticipated. Sarah Mitchell, a dedicated scientist who spent most of her time studying dolphin behavior, was about to find herself in a situation that would test every aspect of her intelligence, courage, and determination. Morrison's team maintained their tactical positions while he made the critical decision that would determine how the next few hours would unfold. The training exercise had prepared them for many scenarios, but dealing with a civilian who had accidentally wandered into their operation required a different kind of thinking. As he observed Sarah's continued approach, Morrison realized that this situation was about to become a test of much more than their military training. The stage was set for an extraordinary encounter between a marine biologist who had simply wanted to enjoy her morning run and 300, one of the military's most elite warriors who were trained to respond to any unexpected situation with overwhelming force and precision. Neither Sarah nor the SEALs could have predicted that this chance meeting would soon become a demonstration of courage, intelligence, and human determination that would be talked about for years to come. The moment of confrontation arrived when Lieutenant Commander Morrison stepped forward and raised his voice with the authority that had commanded respect in combat zones across 3 continents. His words cut through the morning air with military precision, demanding that Sarah stop immediately and identify herself. The tone was unmistakably serious, carrying the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Sarah felt her heart rate spike as the full reality of her situation became clear. She was no longer dealing with a training exercise that she had accidentally observed. Instead, she had somehow become the focal point of what appeared to be a serious military operation involving hundreds of highly trained personnel. The marine biologist in her recognized that she was now experiencing the kind of stress response she had studied in marine mammals when they encountered unexpected predators. Morrison's training had taught him to establish immediate control in uncertain situations, and his approach toward Sarah was calculated to project authority while maintaining tactical awareness. Behind him, 300 Navy SEALs maintained their positions, each one trained to respond instantly to their commander's signals. The collective presence of so much military expertise focused on one individual created an atmosphere of intense pressure that few civilians would ever experience. Sarah stopped running and raised her hands in what she hoped was a universally recognized gesture of non-aggression. Her scientific background had included training in animal behavior, and she understood that sudden movements or aggressive postures could escalate dangerous situations. However, her mind was also working furiously to understand exactly what these military personnel thought she had done to warrant such an overwhelming response. The lieutenant commander's questions came in rapid succession, delivered with the kind of intensity that was designed to break down deception and reveal truth quickly. He demanded to know who she was, why she was in this area, who she was working for, and whether she understood that she had entered a restricted military zone. Each question was delivered with increasing pressure, as Morrison applied interrogation techniques that had been proven effective in combat situations. Sarah's initial responses were stammered and confused, which only served to increase Morrison's suspicion. Her explanation that she was simply out for her regular morning jog sounded implausible given the timing and location of her appearance. The lieutenant commander had seen too many cover stories in his military career to accept simple explanations without thorough verification, especially during a training exercise that specifically included deception scenarios. The interrogation intensified as Morrison demanded proof of Sarah's identity and explanations for inconsistencies in her story that existed only in his trained paranoia. Sarah found herself struggling to provide satisfactory answers to questions that seemed designed to trap her in contradictions. Her scientific background had prepared her for rigorous academic questioning, but nothing had prepared her for this kind of aggressive, rapid-fire interrogation by someone who seemed convinced she represented a threat. Behind Morrison, the 301 Navy SEALs maintained perfect tactical discipline while observing the unfolding situation. Each warrior was prepared to respond instantly if their commander determined that force was necessary. The collective weight of their attention and readiness created an atmosphere that would have intimidated even trained military personnel, let alone a civilian scientist who had simply chosen the wrong path for her morning exercise. Sarah's confusion and fear began to transform into something else as she realized that these military personnel were treating her as a serious threat despite her obvious civilian status. Her scientific training had taught her to observe and analyze situations objectively, and she began to understand that she had somehow become caught up in a training scenario that had taken on a life of its own. The realization that she was being held by hundreds of elite warriors for no legitimate reason began to spark something deeper than fear. Morrison's interrogation techniques were designed to break down resistance and reveal hidden agendas, but Sarah had no hidden agenda to reveal. Her growing frustration with being treated as a terrorist when she was clearly just a lost jogger began to override her initial fear. The marine biologist who had spent years studying dominant behavior patterns in ocean predators was beginning to recognize that she was dealing with a textbook case of institutional overreaction. The standoff continued as Morrison demanded explanations that Sarah could not provide because the premises of his questions were fundamentally flawed. He was looking for evidence of deception and planning where none existed, applying counterterrorism protocols to a situation that required nothing more than basic common sense. However, the training exercise had created a context where common sense was being overridden by tactical procedures designed for entirely different circumstances. Sarah's scientific mind began analyzing the group dynamics she was observing. She recognized that Morrison and his team were trapped in a feedback loop where their own training was preventing them from accurately assessing the situation. Their preparation for dealing with genuine threats was causing them to interpret her innocent presence as something sinister, and their collective investment in the training scenario was making it difficult for anyone to step back and question the basic assumptions. The morning sun continued to rise, and Sarah realized that this confrontation could continue indefinitely unless someone found a way to break the cycle of suspicion and escalation. Her background in marine biology had taught her that dominant predators often needed to save face when they discovered that their aggressive posturing had been directed at something that was never actually a threat. The challenge was finding a way to allow these highly trained warriors to recognize their mistake without humiliating them in front of their peers. Morrison's frustration was growing as his interrogation techniques failed to produce the admissions or revelations he expected. Sarah's responses remained consistent with her claimed identity as a civilian scientist, but his training had taught him that sophisticated operatives were capable of maintaining cover stories under intense pressure. The lieutenant commander found himself caught between his instinct that something about this situation was fundamentally wrong and his obligation to follow protocols designed to protect national security. Sarah began to understand that she was dealing with a massive case of mistaken identity that had been amplified by military training and group psychology. Her scientific background had taught her to look for the simplest explanations that fit the available evidence, and the evidence clearly suggested that these military personnel had convinced themselves that she represented a threat that simply did not exist. The question was whether she could find a way to help them recognize their error without triggering an even more aggressive response. The 300 Navy SEALs continued to maintain their tactical positions while their commander attempted to extract information from someone who had no useful information to provide. Each warrior was prepared for combat, but none of them were prepared for the possibility that their target was exactly what she appeared to be: a civilian scientist who had accidentally wandered into their training exercise at the worst possible moment. Sarah's initial fear was being replaced by a different kind of determination as she realized the absurdity of her situation. She was being held and interrogated by hundreds of elite military personnel because she had chosen to go jogging at the wrong time and place. Her scientific training had taught her to approach problems systematically, and she began to consider whether there might be ways to demonstrate her identity and intentions that would satisfy even the most paranoid military mind. Morrison's questioning became more aggressive as he applied psychological pressure techniques designed to break down resistance. However, Sarah had no resistance to break down because she had nothing to hide. Her growing irritation with being treated as a terrorist began to override her natural deference to authority, and she started to push back against questions that she considered unreasonable and accusations that she knew were completely unfounded. The confrontation had reached a critical point where both sides were becoming entrenched in positions that made resolution increasingly difficult. Morrison was convinced that Sarah's failure to provide satisfactory explanations indicated deception, while Sarah was becoming increasingly frustrated with being forced to defend herself against charges that made no logical sense. The training exercise had created a scenario where military protocol was preventing anyone from stepping back and applying basic common sense to an obviously mistaken situation. Sarah's background in studying animal behavior had taught her that dominant creatures often became more aggressive when their initial displays of power failed to achieve the desired response. She was beginning to recognize that Morrison and his team were trapped in exactly this kind of escalating cycle, where their inability to break her non-existent cover story was causing them to apply even more pressure in the belief that greater force would eventually produce the results they expected. The morning air carried the tension of a situation that had spiraled far beyond its original parameters, with a marine biologist and 301 Navy SEALs locked in a confrontation that none of them had anticipated and that had no obvious resolution through conventional military protocols. The transformation in Sarah Mitchell began when Lieutenant Commander Morrison made the tactical error of underestimating the intelligence and determination of the woman he was interrogating. His decision to escalate the confrontation by suggesting that she would be detained indefinitely until she revealed her true agenda triggered something in Sarah that her years of academic research had prepared her for better than any military training could have prepared the SEALs for what was about to happen. Sarah's scientific background had required her to defend doctoral research in front of panels of aggressive academics who were trained to find flaws in even the most carefully prepared work. She had spent years learning how to think clearly under pressure, how to identify logical fallacies in complex arguments, and how to maintain intellectual integrity when faced with unreasonable challenges. These skills, combined with her growing anger at being treated as a terrorist for the crime of jogging, were about to create a perfect storm that would catch the Navy SEALs completely off guard. Morrison's assumption that increased pressure would eventually break Sarah's resistance was based on interrogation techniques that were designed for individuals who actually had something to hide. However, Sarah had nothing to conceal, which meant that pressure tactics only served to clarify her thinking rather than cloud it. Her scientific mind began analyzing the logical inconsistencies in Morrison's approach with the same systematic thoroughness she applied to research problems that had stumped other marine biologists. The moment that would later be discussed in military training academies for years to come occurred when Sarah stopped responding defensively to Morrison's accusations and instead began asking him questions that exposed the fundamental flaws in his reasoning. Her first question was devastatingly simple. If she were truly a sophisticated operative who had infiltrated their training exercise, why would she have approached their position so openly instead of maintaining concealment and observing from a distance? Morrison's response revealed the first crack in his certainty as he struggled to provide a logical answer to a question that cut directly to the heart of his assumptions. Sarah pressed her advantage by asking a series of follow-up questions that demonstrated her understanding of basic tactical principles and exposed the absurdity of treating someone who had announced her presence so obviously as a covert threat. Her scientific training in logical analysis was proving to be more effective than any military counterinterrogation course could have been. The 300 Navy SEALs who had been observing the confrontation began to witness something that none of their training had prepared them for. A civilian was systematically dismantling their commander's tactical reasoning using nothing more than careful questions and logical analysis. Sarah's approach was not confrontational in a way that could be interpreted as aggressive, but it was relentlessly effective in exposing the weaknesses in the military response to her presence. Sarah's next move was to demonstrate her intimate knowledge of the local area by describing specific landmarks, wildlife patterns, and environmental details that only someone who regularly spent time in this location could possibly know. Her description of seasonal changes in dolphin migration patterns, the effects of recent storms on beach erosion, and the daily schedules of other regular joggers provided evidence of long-term familiarity that would have been impossible for a foreign operative to acquire without extended surveillance. Morrison found himself in the uncomfortable position of having his tactical assumptions challenged by someone who was demonstrating superior knowledge of the local environment. Sarah's detailed descriptions of natural phenomena that she observed during her regular runs provided a level of specific, verifiable information that began to undermine the foundation of his suspicion. However, his training made it difficult for him to admit error in front of his team. The confrontation took another decisive turn when Sarah began explaining the basic principles of marine biology research and her specific work with dolphin migration patterns. Her technical knowledge was clearly genuine, delivered with the kind of passion and detail that could not be faked. She described research methodologies, ongoing experiments, and recent discoveries in her field with an expertise that would have required years of legitimate academic training to acquire. Sarah's scientific credentials became even more convincing when she offered to provide specific details about her research that could be verified through academic databases and institutional records. She named colleagues, described ongoing projects, and provided information about recent publications that Morrison could easily confirm if he chose to do so. Her willingness to submit to verification demonstrated a confidence that was inconsistent with someone who was maintaining a false identity. The marine biologist's most effective tactic was her systematic deconstruction of the military's interpretation of her behavior. She pointed out that everything they had observed was perfectly consistent with someone who was genuinely lost and confused, and that none of her actions had demonstrated any of the tactical awareness or strategic thinking that would be expected from a trained operative. Her analysis was logical, comprehensive, and devastatingly accurate. Morrison's position became increasingly untenable as Sarah continued to expose the flaws in his reasoning while maintaining a respectful but determined tone. She was not attacking his competence or training, but she was relentlessly demonstrating that his expertise was being applied to a situation where it was not only unnecessary, but counterproductive. The lieutenant commander was discovering that sometimes the most dangerous opponent is someone who has nothing to lose and no reason to be intimidated. Sarah's background in studying animal behavior gave her insights into the group dynamics she was observing among the Navy SEALs. She recognized that Morrison was trapped by his own authority structure and the expectations of his team, which made it difficult for him to acknowledge error without losing face. Her scientific training had taught her how to present evidence in ways that allowed people to change their minds without feeling humiliated, and she began applying these skills to her current situation. The turning point came when Sarah offered to submit to any reasonable verification process that would confirm her identity, while pointing out that continued detention without cause was not only unnecessary, but potentially illegal. Her knowledge of legal principles related to military authority over civilians demonstrated an intellectual sophistication that was becoming increasingly difficult to reconcile with Morrison's original assumptions about her identity and intentions. Sarah's most powerful weapon was her refusal to be intimidated by the overwhelming display of military force surrounding her. Her scientific background had taught her that truth was more powerful than authority, and that careful reasoning could overcome even the most aggressive opposition if it was applied consistently and without fear. She was demonstrating these principles in real time while 301 Navy SEALs watched in growing amazement. Morrison realized that he was facing a type of challenge that his military training had not prepared him for. Sarah was not resisting his authority through force or deception, but through the systematic application of logical analysis that was exposing the fundamental weaknesses in his approach. She was winning the confrontation not by fighting the military's superior power, but by demonstrating that their power was being applied inappropriately. The 300 Navy SEALs were witnessing a masterclass in intellectual courage as Sarah continued to press her case with growing confidence and effectiveness. Her transformation from a confused and frightened jogger into a formidable advocate for reason and justice was happening in real time, and it was becoming clear that the military's overwhelming numerical and tactical superiority was useless against someone who refused to accept unreasonable treatment. Sarah's scientific training had taught her that the most effective way to challenge established thinking was through patient, systematic questioning rather than direct confrontation. She was applying these techniques to deconstruct the military's entire approach to her situation, and the results were becoming increasingly difficult for Morrison and his team to ignore. The confrontation was evolving into a demonstration of how intellectual integrity and moral courage could triumph over institutional authority when that authority was being exercised inappropriately. The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, and the situation that had begun with a simple case of mistaken identity was becoming something much more significant, a test of whether reason and justice could prevail when challenged by overwhelming force and institutional momentum. Sarah Mitchell was proving that sometimes the most powerful response to unreasonable authority is the systematic application of logical thinking and moral courage. The climactic moment of the confrontation arrived when Sarah Mitchell made a decision that would be studied in leadership courses for decades to come. Instead of continuing to defend herself against accusations that she knew were baseless, she took complete control of the situation by demanding that Lieutenant Commander Morrison and his team justify their actions to her. The marine biologist who had been treated as a suspected terrorist for the past 2 hours transformed herself into the moral authority in a situation that had spiraled completely out of reasonable control. Sarah's decisive action came when she stood up straighter, looked Morrison directly in the eyes, and told him that his behavior was unacceptable and that she expected immediate corrective action. Her tone carried the authority of someone who knew she was absolutely right, and who was no longer willing to tolerate being treated unreasonably. The 301 Navy SEALs witnessed something unprecedented, a civilian taking moral command of a situation involving the military's most elite personnel. Morrison found himself in the extraordinary position of being lectured about proper conduct by the same person he had been interrogating as a potential security threat. Sarah's systematic dismantling of his tactical reasoning had evolved into a comprehensive critique of the military's entire approach to her situation. She was no longer asking for understanding. She was demanding accountability from personnel who were trained to be the ones demanding accountability from others. Sarah's background in marine biology had taught her about dominance hierarchies in animal groups, and She recognized that Morrison's authority was based entirely on the assumption that his actions were justified. By systematically proving that his actions were not justified, she had undermined the foundation of his authority and created space for her own moral leadership. Her scientific training was proving more effective than any military strategy could have been in the current circumstances. The confrontation reached its peak when Sarah began explaining to Morrison exactly what he needed to do to resolve the situation appropriately. She outlined the steps required for a proper apology, the verification procedures that should have been followed from the beginning, and the protocols that should have prevented the entire incident from occurring. Her recommendations were delivered with the same systematic thoroughness she applied to scientific research, and they were impossible to argue with. Morrison realized that he was facing a complete reversal of the power dynamic that had defined the situation for the past 2 hours. The woman he had been treating as a potential threat was now providing him with professional guidance on how to conduct military operations more effectively. Her recommendations were based on principles of logic and justice that his own military training claimed to support, which made them impossible to reject without revealing fundamental inconsistencies in his approach. Sarah's transformation was complete when she began addressing not just Morrison, but the entire group of 301 Navy SEALs, explaining how their collective behavior had created an unjust situation and what they needed to do to restore their own professional integrity. Her scientific background had taught her how to present complex information to large audiences, and she was applying these skills to deliver what amounted to a lecture on ethics and leadership to the military's most elite personnel. The 300 Navy SEALs found themselves in the unprecedented position of receiving instruction from a civilian about proper military conduct. Sarah's analysis of their group behavior was delivered with scientific objectivity, but her conclusions about their failures were devastating. She was explaining how their own training and protocols could be improved to prevent similar incidents in the future, and her recommendations were based on principles that none of them could reasonably dispute. Morrison's response to Sarah's demands revealed the full extent of the transformation that had taken place. Instead of maintaining his authoritarian stance, he found himself apologizing and acknowledging that mistakes had been made. The lieutenant commander who had begun the confrontation, convinced of his tactical superiority, was now accepting guidance from the civilian he had originally suspected of being a security threat. The power dynamic had been completely reversed through nothing more than logical reasoning and moral courage. Sarah's final demonstration of control came when she began coordinating the resolution of the incident herself. She provided Morrison with specific instructions about how to verify her identity through proper channels, explained the documentation that would be required to prevent similar incidents in the future, and outlined the reporting procedures that should be followed to ensure accountability. Her scientific background in project management was being applied to manage a military operation more effectively than the military personnel had managed it themselves. The 301 Navy SEALs who had begun the morning as participants in a training exercise found themselves witnesses to a masterclass in leadership, courage, and moral authority. Sarah Mitchell had demonstrated that intellectual integrity and ethical clarity could triumph over institutional power when that power was being exercised inappropriately. Her transformation from suspected threat to moral leader was complete, and the lessons of her example would influence military training for years to come. Morrison's team began implementing Sarah's recommendations with the same precision they applied to military operations. The verification procedures she had outlined were more thorough than their original protocols, and her suggestions for preventing similar incidents revealed gaps in their training that none of them had previously recognized. The civilian who had been treated as a security risk was now improving their operational effectiveness through her systematic analysis of their procedures. Sarah's scientific approach to problem-solving had proven superior to military tactics in a situation that required careful thinking rather than overwhelming force. Her ability to maintain logical clarity under extreme pressure, combined with her refusal to be intimidated by unreasonable authority, had created a resolution that served everyone's legitimate interests while exposing the flaws in the original military response. The incident concluded with Sarah receiving formal apologies from Morrison and acknowledgement from the entire SEAL team that their response had been inappropriate. However, the more significant outcome was the recognition that her systematic approach to analyzing and resolving the situation had been superior to the military's initial response. The marine biologist had not only defended herself successfully but had provided the military with valuable lessons about effective leadership and ethical conduct. Sarah's final act was to provide Morrison with her contact information and an invitation to discuss how similar incidents could be prevented in the future. Her willingness to work collaboratively with the people who had wrongly suspected her demonstrated the same scientific objectivity that had enabled her to analyze their behavior effectively. She was treating the entire incident as a learning experience that could benefit everyone involved. The 301 Navy SEALs departed from the encounter with a new understanding of civilian courage and intellectual leadership. They had witnessed someone with no military training outperform their own elite procedures through nothing more than careful thinking, moral clarity, and the courage to insist on reasonable treatment. Sarah Mitchell had proven that sometimes the most powerful weapon is the systematic application of logical reasoning by someone who refuses to accept unreasonable authority. Morrison's final report on the incident became required reading in military leadership courses, not because it described successful military tactics, but because it documented how a civilian had demonstrated superior leadership skills in a situation where military training had failed. The lieutenant commander's honest analysis of what had gone wrong and what could be learned from Sarah's example became a model for professional accountability and continuous improvement. Sarah returned to her marine biology research with a new understanding of her own capabilities and a story that would inspire others for years to come. Her experience had demonstrated that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary results when they combined intellectual courage with moral determination. The wrong woman had become exactly the right person to teach 301 Navy SEALs about the true nature of strength, leadership, and justice. The incident became legend within military circles as an example of how civilians could teach military personnel valuable lessons about effective leadership when institutional procedures failed to serve legitimate purposes. Sarah Mitchell's name became synonymous with intellectual courage and the power of systematic thinking to overcome overwhelming odds. Her transformation from suspected terrorist to respected teacher had proven that sometimes being in the wrong place at the wrong time can create opportunities to demonstrate exactly the right kind of character and capability.